All right, I'll just get us going. Others might join, but we're going to record this so they can always catch the beginning later. So welcome, everyone. My name is Natalie Sampson. I am the co-lead of the Community Engagement Core for the Michigan Center of Life Stage Environment Exposures and Disease, a total mouthful, but what we like to call the M-LEEaD Center. And this work is funded by the National Institute for Environmental Health Sciences. I'm just going to give you a little bit about what we do and what the series is, and then hurry up and get to our brilliant speakers who we have with us today. So the work we do in the Community Engagement Core is led by a stakeholder action board. So lots of amazing community-based groups and local government agencies who support our mission to really connect communities, youth, policymakers, researchers around environmental health issues. And we have a lot of recordings from this series, the M-LEEaD series called Residents and Researchers, on topics from gentrification, plastics, air quality standards, disaster preparedness, and so on. We'll be sure to share that link with you so you can check some of those out. But really, the stars of the show today, we're lucky to have our Julius Buzzard, who is the Executive Director of Growing Hope, and Francesca Williamson, who also goes by FW, who is an assistant professor of learning health sciences at the medical school, a faculty associate for Research Center for Group Dynamics at ISR, the Institute for Social Research, and also on appointment with the Health Behavior, Health Equity. And we are just really thrilled to have these two talking about right to food, right to grow, specifically in Washtenaw County, but I think these lessons will be for all of us, wherever you're calling in from. So we'll spend about a half an hour hearing from them. I think they might have some questions for you in the process, and then we'll make sure to leave time at the end for some question and answer. Feel free to throw your questions in as they come to you, and I can track on those, and we'll have a little bit of a discussion at the end. So with that, I'm going to hand the floor over to our friends here and let them get started.
All right. Thank you so much for that generous introduction. We're excited to be able to talk with you today about work that we've been building out slowly over the past couple of years. But to get us started, we have a question for you. We want to hear what words or ideas or phrases come to mind when you hear the right to food and the right to grow. You can, if you're able to, go ahead and use the chat to drop in words or ideas that come to mind when you hear the right to food and the right to grow. And if you're engaged in different kinds of food practices, feel free to also share what those are in the chat. We'll give you about a minute or so to do that. And as those ideas start coming in, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Julius, but feel free to keep dropping your ideas in the chat. We'll return to those in the Q&A at the end.
Awesome. Thank you, FW. Thanks, everyone, again for coming today. Just to give you a little outline, I'm going to share a little bit, do some background about food systems and food sovereignty and some of the right to food, right to grow definitions that we're talking about right now. If you have participated in, because I see some names that are familiar with and have been to or about with Food Literacy for All, these first two slides are going to seem very familiar to you, but hopefully you get something new from it. So just starting off with the food system, when we talk about food systems, we're not just talking about farms or grocery stores. The food system is an interconnected web: land, labor, policies, infrastructure, capital, transportation, processing, marketing, and waste. All of this organized into ways that feed our population. And as we're talking about this work, as we talk about and continuing to food justice and food sovereignty, it's important for us to recognize that the system has a history along with our country. Here in the United States, the modern food system is rooted in colonization and slavery. It's rooted in stolen land, enslaved labor, and extraction. Those are foundations that still shape who owns land, who works the hardest, and who eats last. Just a few pieces of that history that I'll pull out. In 1933, USDA subsidies formalized much of the system, stabilizing prices and production, but overwhelmingly benefiting white landowners, excluding Black and Indigenous farmers by design. After World War I, there was a surplus of nerve gases, which were diluted and rebranded as pesticides. And then after the Second World War, nitrogen plants built to make bombs were converted to produce ammonia for chemical fertilizer. So war technology has been translated into food technology in our country. These things tell us that the system was built to optimize. It was built for scale, control, and for profit, not necessarily for health, for equity, or for relationship. And the impacts of this unjust food system we see everywhere. We see it environmentally with soil degradation, water contamination, climate instability. We see it in workers, and we see it in communities. So when we talk about fixing the food system, we're not just talking about making little tweaks. When we talk about things like right to food and right to grow, we're really talking about transforming a food system that was built for profit, not necessarily for people. So when we talk about food justice starts with a simple truth. Food is not a privilege, but it's a human right. But food justice doesn't just stop at asking who has food. It asks why some people don't have food and who benefits from that arrangement. The food justice movement grows out of environmental justice from the 1980s, when Black, Indigenous, and frontline communities were named something that was essential. They named that mainstream environmentalism had become elite, white, and disconnected from human survival. They named that pollution, hunger, and disease weren't accidents. They were patterned, they were racialized, and they were political. So when we talk about food justice, it pushes us beyond just the phrase or the way of thinking around food access. And a way of thinking about it is through question. If food access asks the question, can you get food? Food justice then asks questions like, who owns the land? Who controls the seed? Who controls the capital? Whose food traditions are being valued? Whose are being erased? And how has colonization shaped what we eat, grow, and call healthy? When we look honestly at the U.S., at U.S. history, we see clearly that land and food have been weaponized again and again through genocide, through land theft, through Jim Crow, in many other ways. And still, people have always found alternatives. They found things like mutual aid, freedom farms, community gardens, some of the things that have been in the chat that I saw right when we started today, cooperative markets, and more. So food justice is about remembering those lineages and refusing to normalize harm. Food sovereignty is a direct response to colonization and other forms of oppression. Food sovereignty comes from the global South, from a peasant and indigenous land-based movement. You can actually go back one slide. Thank you. Organizing for survival and dignity. It's a direct response to colonization, displacement, and extraction. It is if food justice, so we've talked about food access and food justice, and now I've introduced food sovereignty. So if food access is asking questions like who can access food, and then we think about food justice as helping us to name what the actual problem is. Food sovereignty is a naming what the solution is. Food sovereignty says things like communities have the right to define their own food systems, what they grow, how they grow it, who grows it, and who eats it. Capitalism treats food as a commodity, something that's owned, traded, and speculated on, where food sovereignty rejects that logic. To embrace food sovereignty is to say things like food is about care, culture, land, and community, not about profit. The next slide is just the pillars of food sovereignty. So the 7 pillars of food sovereignty that I wanted to share with you all. We're not going to go into depth with each one of them, That is for another day, but it's important to know that food sovereignty is not just an idea, it's not just a phrase or a slogan, but there are deep values in these pillars that go into building what it is. So to go now a little bit more into, bringing these definitions and these histories into the work that we're doing today. As Natalie shared, I'm the executive director at Growing Hope, which is a nonprofit here in Ypsilanti. It's on the other side of the county from the university. Growing Hope, here we have just our mission statement. Growing Hope fosters a just and equitable local food system where all people are empowered to grow, buy, sell, prepare, and eat nourishing food. Usually when I'm talking about the work that we do, when I talk about Growing Hope, what I say to people is that we are investing in building food sovereignty in Ypsilanti and Southeast Michigan. As you probably can tell from the past couple of slides, that can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people. But the way that I like to say it most plainly is that we want to invite people into more intimate, just, and joyful relationships with food and the food system. And that looks like a lot of different things. It looks like eating your food, looks like how you grow it, looks like how you buy it, looks like how you sell it. We're doing this work primarily through each of our 4 program areas represented on this pinwheel. Our farm and garden, we're growing food with and for people in the community. We have about a 1.5 acre farm located just outside of downtown Ypsilanti, where we're doing a lot of that work, but really equipping people through building garden beds, compost, seedlings, like really giving them the tools to be able to grow for themselves, as well as education. And that comes for folks of all ages, but I'd say a primary demographic is youth in schools. We have a team program where we have about a dozen youth who work year-round here at the farm. And then at our other location downtown, the Ypsilanti Farmers Marketplace, we steward our local farmers markets. We have a shared use incubator kitchen where folks can come and incubate, grow a food business. Continue the next slide. So these values and these ideas of having, like food being a human right, having the right to food and the right to grow are very central to the work that we do as an organization. As we think about how we, with the right to food, how we help provide dignified access to food, and the right to grow around land use and protection and making sure people can grow their food if and when they want to. In Washtenaw County, our county is not a food desert. We like to be very asset-based in the way that we approach the work that we're doing. So we think of our county as a place of deep food wisdom. We have multiple generational growers. We have cultural foodways, youth leadership. We have elders feeding neighbors. We have mutual aid networks that are outpacing institutions often in times of crisis. We have all of this infrastructure that already exists. And still with that, there are zoning inconsistencies that make it harder for people to grow food in different places. There are planning systems that are fragmented. Residents most impacted by inequity have the least formal governance power. So the question that we're asking is not whether we know how to feed each other. The question is whether our systems are aligned with what communities already know and are doing well. The right to food, as we mentioned earlier, the right to food is a dignified, culturally meaningful access for every resident. Not surplus, not stigma, not low-income programming, but I really want to highlight that word dignity. If someone can plant grass freely, they should be able to plant collards freely. So the right to grow, then, is the ability to cultivate land without unnecessary regulatory harm. A county resolution, as we're talking about this work, it's not, and as we use these phrases, especially the right to food, I really want to emphasize and have been emphasizing it's not symbolic. It's not just like a feel good. You put it on a slogan, you put it on a T-shirt, like food is a human right sort of thing. But the way that we're approaching this, and we hope that others will join us in, is as a real policy tool. It tells every department, every planner, health department, the Parks and Rec, economic development, to align with this, to protect this, and to remove barriers to this. And just one other thing about this part of it is the right to food is not something that we came up with. There are people across the country, across the globe, doing work within the right to food. There are many countries who have codified the right to food in their constitution. There are 2 states here, Maine and New Jersey, that have made amendments to their state constitutions to codify the right to food, and several others who are along the way. So there's real movement behind this, and it's actionable for our communities. And then just to tie it back in, food sovereignty is not just a niche agricultural issue, it's a public health infrastructure. Food sovereignty prevents diet-related diseases through access, not through compliance. It reduces environmental exposure through local land stewardship. It supports mental health, belonging, cultural continuity, and it's just power towards communities most impacted by inequity. So when we're talking about people controlling their food system, health outcomes will naturally follow. It's not, it's upstream work. And upstream work is always policy work.
Thanks, Julius. So I'm going to briefly touch on some of the ways that we're starting to build out a community academic partnership to support this right to food and right to grow through policy. We're starting out locally within Washtenaw County, but thinking about how do we leverage what we're doing here locally to co-learn from what other people are doing across the state. And as Julius mentioned, working towards something that's statewide, a statewide amendment to support the right to food and the right to grow in Michigan State. But first, I wanted to highlight some of the things that we've been talking about in terms of the value of community and academic partnerships. I think most folks know intuitively that you should engage communities when trying to do any kind of public health intervention or developing any kind of solution. But oftentimes, health-related work and interventions happen without close partnership or input from communities and community organizations who've been doing this work for a really long time. And so as part of our work, we draw from the design justice principles, and one of them suggests that before intervening or developing a new research project or developing a new idea, you should study what communities are already doing, because communities may be developing models that we can learn from to forward our efforts to close the evidence to practice gap that we're all working toward. And part of that is investing in community power. Communities are situated in place, they have the historical knowledge, the intergenerational relationships, and really the infrastructure that could support creating and building the infrastructure for healthy communities. And so part of that is approaching this work, recognizing that communities have valuable expertise that we can all learn from, and that there are things that we can mutually benefit from in thinking through real-world problems that impact in communities. And oftentimes, academic and scientific research will sit in journals that no one reads, or will only speak to the concerns of academic communities. And these kinds of partnerships call for a different kind of responsibility to community. And this is important too, because oftentimes, unfortunately, institutions are part of the harm that communities are experiencing. So part of the work of community academic partnerships is repairing those relationships and leveraging the science and leveraging the research to be in service of community-driven system change. I wanted to highlight just a couple of challenges that comes with this work. The first one being that there are often uneven resources between institutions and community-related organizations. And so we have to think creatively about how do we leverage and develop a pool of resources that can support what communities are doing to deal with some of those asymmetries. That, I think, in practice is really hard to do, but it's aspirational, and I think it's a responsibility for academics and researchers. The other point that I want to highlight is trust. Oftentimes in public health, folks talk about trusting, trying to build trust with communities, but in some of the groups that I'm in, we've been thinking a lot about what does it mean to trust community to drive change, to trust community to set priorities, and to trust the knowledge and expertise that community members and community organizations hold. So those are just some high-level points about that. And we're also thinking about community academic partnership as a public health strategy in its own right. As Julius mentioned, we're taking very much a strengths-based orientation to the work and thinking about what are the strengths and what's the community wisdom that's already in place that we could invest in and augment to forward the right to food and the right to grow. And how might this kind of intervention support our efforts to invest in the health of communities beyond just what's needed for clinical treatments, for example, for patients and community members who may have some food or diet-related health conditions? The clinical treatment point is just one point in their sphere of health. So how do we invest in the community infrastructure that can further nourish and support people in striving towards their health goals? Another part of our work to grow and learn together is to think about how do we dream about what food sovereignty might look like in practice, not as a symbolic one, as Julius noted, but how do we practically transform the food system? So we've been doing, on the academic side, some of us have been volunteering with Growing Hope to get a sense of what are the actual processes and outcomes of engaging in this work from the community member perspective, and what might be some of the learnings there that could inform the kind of metrics that we think about in measuring what food sovereignty does for the health of communities. We've also, for the past several months, been engaging in food policy or policy advocacy training to co-develop a strategy, a food policy campaign that can be enacted locally. Beyond those efforts, we've also started recruiting and partnering with Black and Indigenous scholars and people of color who are researching and interested in food sovereignty and thinking about how we can bring together our various areas of expertise to support this Right to Food and Right to Grow initiative. Again, thinking about how can we co-learn from our various areas of expertise and the community wisdom to guide this work. And beyond the things that we're doing together, we're also engaging with broader national efforts to learn what have other people in other state contexts been doing to forward the right to food and the right to grow. One such place is the National Right to Food Community of Practice that offers monthly gatherings and resources and toolkits that we can borrow from and adapt for the work that we're doing here in Washtenaw County. Just to give you a little glimpse into our path to the Right to Food and Right to Grow resolution in Washtenaw County, we're starting out with building upon the work that Growing Hope has been doing for years to co-create a community-rooted resolution for the right to food and the right to grow. And then from there, thinking about seeking out partnerships and sponsorships from the Washtenaw County Board of Commissioners And this is a critical step too, because much of the work that's happening locally in the policy environment is really aligned already with what we're thinking about for the right to grow and the right to food. So these are strategic partnerships, but also ways for us to shape what this resolution might look like. And then, as I mentioned at the beginning, one of the challenges that we've been thinking about is how do we create a shared language around what the right to food and the right to grow means. When we talk about food, it means something different to different people. And we want people to think about food and food systems more expansively than just beyond just what we eat and how we consume and share food. And then once we're in the process of developing the shared language, we're hoping to garner cross-sectoral support to hear the stories and get data around what are the barriers to food sovereignty here locally in different aspects of the food system, whether that's production, whether that's things like working with the market or people growing food. We've taken a look at things like some of the ordinances that might be in place that are prohibiting people's ability to, for example, keep chickens. And then finally, because we want to implement the things that we want to see, we don't want this to just be a symbolic win. We want to partner with different groups to think about how do we implement this, drawing from the science of implementation, for example. And then in preparing for this talk, we thought a little bit about how this work connects to M-LEEads. And I hope it's clear from points that Julius has raised earlier that because the food justice movement came from environmental justice and food sovereignty was deeply related to not just what people eat, but how we ethically produce food and how food is circulated in communities, how people make a living and live with food. Environmental health is critical to food sovereignty. So the right to food and the right to grow. We need to ensure that people are able to grow food in environments that aren't toxic to them. And there are many examples and useful cases that we can draw from the environmental impacts and exposures related to growing and producing food. From moving from resolution to relationship, in the last maybe the last year or so, food has often been a bargaining chip for policy. We've experienced this at the state level, but also nationally with SNAP cuts and other ways that food-related supports and infrastructure have been dismantled. So if we, as Julius noted, think about food sovereignty as an upstream solution for health conditions that are more expansive of food-related diseases, but also thinking about the health of our environment, there's more that this moment demands of us that can build accountable systems to improve the health of communities through food. So we invite you to think about ways that you could partner with us and share your insights and expertise about how we might think through alternative metrics or measures related to environmental exposures that can support our case for the right to food and the right to grow. We also invite you to think with us about what are some of the ways that have worked either locally or elsewhere for implementing changes to advance the right to food and the right to grow. All right, so we are at the end of our slides, and just as a main point, communities have always fed themselves, and our goal is to think about how the right to food and the right to grow can honor that practice and do so in a way that's ethical and affirms our dignity and rights. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was so great. And I feel like you were able to speak to lots of different audiences. I can see some names on the list, and folks are coming from doing food work. Some are coming from environmental health. Some are, so it's just really helpful to see that we all have a place to help move this together with you. And I love how you ended with what you can do. I'm curious to hear a little bit as you asked this question at the beginning, and folks, please throw questions in the chat, questions in the Q&A, and I'll make sure to look at them. But sort of stepping out of the slides and just sharing a little bit about, okay, we're there. What does it look like? What does it feel like if this was to be principles to practice to policy? What would that look like in some ways? Can you give some examples for folks? Either one of you.
Well, one of the things that we talked about, and we've Julius can speak to this more, but gather some data around what are ordinances in place that are preventing people from being able to grow food. But also, so there's that piece. And one concrete example that we've talked a lot about is keeping chickens. But I think it's a really good example of what we mean about the regulations and barriers, because it's not evenly distributed across the county. There are pockets of the county where people are able to do that. And so part of our work is to try to figure out what are the stories that people have about the barriers to being able to grow food and their right to food, and what might be alternative solutions to developing that. So I think the chickens is one concrete example that we talked a lot about, and I'll invite Julius to share others.
Yeah, I know. I think that's a good concrete example, and I'm going to tie this into. I was reading a question in the chat that seemed pretty similar, and I'll just read it out loud for anyone who's not reading it, which was, what would the impact of a resolution at a county level be versus, i.e., what would it change in what the county has control over versus what the municipalities have control over. And there's more to it, but I think that there are some things like FW mentioned that could be concrete. I think even in this question, it goes on to talk about things like the senior millage that the county has been involved in a lot over the past couple of years. And I'd say, like, at a county level, there's a part of it that is like the perspective to how those decisions are made. That would be the change for the county. We do recognize that obviously municipalities have a different purview, and our goal with it, I guess, are twofold: to be able to start at the county, because I think that there's a lot of momentum, there's a lot of space in Washtenaw County to make this change or make this sort of resolution, and then working on creating sort of a toolkit or a playbook for how those things can be used by health departments, by parks, by townships, etc., and implemented in some proactive ways. But then also thinking on the other side of it of if a potential end goal, if the end goal really is looking at, like, how do we make a change in our state, it's building this grassroots swell for and support for the right to food, so that we eventually have some representation from across our state who are doing the work to make, like, a larger change that could have more budget implications.
Absolutely. Yeah. And this question was lots of great examples. I'm glad you read it out for folks listening in or listening to the recording. Thanks, Julius. And you said Maine and New Jersey, right, were two states that were really making movement on this. I'm curious if there's other communities or counties in Michigan who are doing this work that you've been able to collaborate, or if you're not there yet.
Yeah, I mean, I've personally connected with some folks in Wayne County who are interested in doing this work, as well as whatever county Kalamazoo is in, and in the Flint area. And then I think that's been helpful with some of the work that FW and I have done as we've just expanded our team. We've also brought in some people who have a much more broad geographic reach. And so getting also, like, perspective from the UP and from other places that we're not actively at. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. That's helpful. Thanks. Someone's also been asking, what's the role of local food policy councils? So maybe first, if you don't mind explaining what a food policy council is in case folks don't know, and then, yeah, bringing that into this conversation.
Yeah, food policy councils, what it is, it's looks different in different places. So I'll speak specifically to our food policy council, Growing Hope, or not Growing Hopes, Washtenaw County's food policy council is like a they report to the board of directors directly. So all of there's 17 or so seats that sit on it. They represent different parts of the food system, and they make recommendations to the board of commissioners. And so a path that we could and likely will take as we're moving this resolution is working with the Food Policy Council, sharing the work that we're doing, and they're like a direct line to the board of commissioners. Food policy councils aren't universal. Not every county, city has food policy council, and they don't work universally either. Some are their own nonprofits. Some are just a group of people who care about food policy. But I think that's like a uniting thing at the end of the day is it's people who care about food policy and how that impacts whatever their region is, trying to make some changes at the regional or county level.
And I'll just add too that the Food Policy Council has also been a site for gathering and getting alternative data sources that aren't necessarily compiled. There's someone who mapped out all of the ordinances related to aspects of the food system, and that was a really useful resource that wasn't being collected or put together anywhere that could inform how we're thinking about different levers for the food sovereignty work.
Thanks. Another question, looking at some of the environmental health implications, soil safety and testing and mitigation, how does that come into your work? I'm sure, related to right to food, right to grow, but also something Growing Hope, I'm sure, is thought about. And if you want to address that question, how do you handle that? And especially working with home gardeners, community gardeners, on site, all the things.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the helps tie it back to the right to food is not just about the food part. It's thinking about the adequacy, the care, the all the way through the food system, all the way into the ground. And so how we do that, I mean, anyone that we're working with to grow food, we always test the soil before we will do any work on it. And with that, we always recommend people to do that. And the county, I think the conservation district will, you can get your soil tested there and you can pay to do it. And in the past, they've had an annual, you can bring X amount of soil to their office and get it tested for free. But that's definitely a part of, we're thinking about food sovereignty, making sure that people are educated and that's part of the equipping with the tools and the resources and knowledge to have adequate food. Because if people's food is not keeping them healthy, then it's not adequate.
Great, thank you. There's so many themes you touched on, the history, where we're at in this moment. I love that dignity came up many times, but I'm curious, maybe if I don't see any other questions coming in, if I can ask you to speak maybe a little bit about, you talked about youth and elders and respect for them in this work. Sort of what does that look like, or could you see in the right to food, right to grow movement and work involving them, or how they're already involved? I'd love to hear more about that.
I think I can start this off, but I want to note that, historically, and the food justice movements have often focused on youth and children because they've often been the targets of campaigns related to unhealthy foods, but also through colonialism and slavery. Youth have been disconnected from generational practices and foodways. And so part of investing in the future of food sovereignty is investing in youth and making sense of how the food system works, being reconnected to land and growing practices, and reclaiming some cultural practices as a way of affirming our rights, but also relations to land and each other. So, and then I'll pass it off to Julius to talk about growing host practices.
I mean, that was great. What else do you need? Um, what we do, what we see, I think that, when you have your hands on the food brings people together. Everybody has to eat. Change, revolution, community all happens around the kitchen table. And I think what we see is that when people are growing food, they're building relationships with their family, with their community, they're building relationships intergenerationally. And I'd say that it's like there's a healing aspect to it of how we build relationships and how we live in community with our ancestors as well. And I say that to share, I think that it's just natural to have inclusion of elders and of youth. Because there's so much wisdom that is passed down. And I'd say actually wisdom that is passed in both directions. We here at Growing Hope, we have 12 teens who work year round down the farm. And if you ever come to our farm, you will see very clearly that we have teens on the farm because they leave their mark. They they paint and they are creative and they inspire us to do things that I think that if it was just, a bunch of adults farming and giving food away, we probably wouldn't do because we're going to prioritize efficiency. And I think similarly, there's times where I'm growing with some elders in our community who are just like founts of wisdom and continually learning. I feel like everything that they say I have to write down because it just needs to be somewhere. And I think when we're growing food, when we're eating food, when we're gathering around food, we're building this intergenerational community, and it makes us all better. And then I'd say the other part of it that we think about is like working with youth. Yes, there's many components of it that are better for the whole for us, and it's how we think about sort of part of our theory of change of how we invest in and build generational health. Because our young folks are coming to us, they're learning about food, they're learning about food sovereignty, they're learning how to grow their own food, like all of these different pieces, and that's things that they're taking to their friends and family today. Mm-hmm. I can't tell you the number of families that will come and they say like, even not just like our teen program, when we have a field trip, they'll say like, my son or my daughter, my grandchild came on a field trip and they won't stop talking about the farm and said, I have to bring them. And that's introducing all these things. And then that's also, introducing the way that they lead their communities, their families as they continue to age.
Yeah, absolutely. FW, you said you all have been, some folks have been volunteering. I don't know if you want to just share reflections from being in that space, but I can say I visited and it's definitely, I can see where the teens have made their mark. It's not a boring space whatsoever. It's beautiful. So, but what about you, FW?
Absolutely. I think my favorite volunteering experience was learning how to compost and composting. Partly because, practically I wanted to learn how to do it because I grow food and I also waste food, but I want that waste to go back to something good. But just being able to see the sheer volumes of foods that's just gone to waste, but also like that, doing that work together with others and hearing the stories that people have to share about food. It was like composting, it smells terrible, but it was a really great way to connect with others. So the composting, that's how I really got into partnering with and thinking with Growing Hope, but also the market. I'm weird and love going to farmers markets everywhere. And I think the Ipsy market is probably one of my favorite ones. It's where I feel like I belong. And I think that it's beyond just picking up the apples or pumpkins that you want to get that are in season. but just really being able to feel a sense of community in the food spaces, I think it has really been healing for me, but also I can see how it's healing for others. Those are my two favorite things. And I try to recruit students and others to come with me to volunteer at Growing Hope.
Awesome. I love it. Well, we have just a few minutes, and I see one more question came in, and we sort of are circling back to the policy topic, but we talked about building coalitions and power at the local level, and then you mentioned some of the state and national work. I don't know, folks want to talk about that a little bit more, sort of how you're tapping into coalition work.
And nationally, there is the National Right to Food Community of Practice, which is hosted by, I think, the University of Miami, but now that I'm saying it out loud, don't hold me to that. It's hosted by a university, but there's folks from all over the country who participate in that. Thanks, FLE, for putting that in the chat. I've been a part of that. We've been a part of that for 3 or 4 years. So a good chunk of the time that it's been running. And that's been a really great community of practice. I think early on, we did a lot of this sort of type of work of like, how do we get the language? How do we make sure everyone's, doing this work together and like building the coalition. So one of the early projects I was a part of is we testified to the UN on the right to food. And since then, the community has grown a lot, which has been really phenomenal. And we've just started, there was a question, maybe it was just yours, Natalie, earlier about like how we get more connected with other folks within our state doing this work, and thinking about building that sort of state level coalition. And I feel like we're just at the point of being able to do that and starting to have more people who are like in individual states doing the work, but having sort of these different blueprint like ways of doing it, like having somebody in the conversation who's in New Jersey, they just passed their constitutional change a month ago, to be able to talk about their process and to talk about how they built coalitions at the state level has been really helpful.
Awesome. Well, we have not much time here. I just want to say thank you. I learned a ton. I'm sure anybody listening in learned a ton. Any final comments? I think I heard an invite if folks want to pop in to volunteer or support Growing Hope. Anything else you want to say as we wrap up today?
Yeah, I mean, we always welcome people to the work, to the farm. I usually say I won't even make you pull weeds. I won't make you flip compost, but it is a fun way to get to know some of the work that we do. We love having people here, and wherever you are in your own community, my invitation would be to think about getting your hands on the dirt this spring.
Great. Anything else, FW, from you?
I second everything Julius just said.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for taking time today, and everyone who joined us. Yeah, I'm inspired. Have a good one, everyone. Stay safe.